Hello and welcome to Literary Notes, a podcast by the Washington Talking Book and Braille Library. I'm your producer, Nathan Ureta. If you're familiar with the history of Seattle, there are a few story beats you might know about. Its railroad rivalry with Tacoma, the Denny regrade, the influx of prospectors on their way to the Klondike, the fire that burned almost 30 city blocks. So much has been said about the people that made Seattle the city it is today. But what about the animals? Dr. Frederick L. Brown seeks to answer this question with his book, The City is More Than Human, An Animal History of Seattle. He sits down with volunteer Chris Snee to talk about Seattle's fauna through the years, from the founding of Fort Nisqually to 1973's poop scoop laws for dog owners. Here's their conversation.
Hello, and welcome to Literary Notes. I'm Chris Snee, and joining me in the studio today is Dr. Fred Brown. Fred's award-winning book, The City is More Than Human, An Animal History of Seattle, invites us to consider Seattle's history not just through a human perspective, but through the cows, horses, dogs, salmon, and other animals that have helped to shape it. Fred, it's good to have you here today.
Thanks for inviting me.
Of course. So why don't we just jump right in? Can you give us a little bit of a background on your history as a historian and kind of what was your impetus for putting this book together?
Yeah, so I got my doctorate at the University of Washington in environmental history, and I guess I've always been interested in how cities, relate to distant places and how that affects people's lives and other creatures' lives, and so I had to find a topic for my dissertation, and I guess, I don't know, I've just always been struck by the different ways we treat different kinds of animals. I grew up in Oklahoma and visited my grandparents' farm in Kansas and saw livestock and the utilitarian way you treat livestock, and that was kind of a shock for a city kid who had we had a cat as a pet. So you see these different ways we treat animals. So I decided it would be interesting to look at how that's changed over time and how it helped create the city. And then starting out the research, I found lots of great documents at the city archives in Seattle. So I felt like it'd be a cool story to jump into and try to see something of what's going on.
It really is. And I think most of us haven't given much thought to what animals have done and continue to do for us, both in this urban environment and now, as your book shows, we had some of those livestock animals wandering the streets in the early days of Seattle, and now we really only encounter them in the grocery store in a much different form.
Right. So it's a big transformation. Yeah.
Yeah. So one theme that I've noticed reading this book is that the animals kind of served as these unwitting intermediaries of humans exerting control over each other throughout the course of Seattle's history, and I think that applies broadly to human existence in some ways too. But talk a little bit about how in the early days with the Hudson's Bay Company setting up, it was Fort Nisqually, is that right?
Right.
Yeah. So there were wild cows roaming the forests. How did that happen?
Yeah. So Fort Nisqually was this fur trading post, but it's also setting up these agricultural operations and bringing in, and the people that worked at the fort were a mix of Scottish and English and mixed race Canadians, French Canadians, and other indigenous people, and even Hawaiians. So there's this real mix of people from around the world, but dominated by this English corporation. And they just had this idea of making money trading furs, which native people hunted, but also having these agricultural operations with cattle. So they would have cattle, but they weren't fenced in and carefully kept track of. They wandered far into the forest, and that was kind of an early way of imposing empire. Like there were these cattle that the Hudson Bay Company claimed as their own, but they were wandering far from the fort. And then if native people would hunt them, which seems a reasonable thing to do, then the HBC people would try to punish them for that or arrest them for that. So
kind of juxtapose then, what was the natives' perspective on encountering, they saw these wild cows wandering through and treated them as any other kind of game.
Yeah.
So what was the point of contention with the white settlers?
The point of contention was how to define the meaning of domestic versus wild, and there's this notion of owning animals as property, that you own them wherever you went, which is a European idea, whereas I think indigenous people had rights to hunt in certain places, but also had more of a collaborative relationship with animals, and saw animals more as fellow creatures that were due respect, and they didn't have this system generally of animals being property. So as people were asserting these animals as property, they were imposing a different way of relating to animals, and they were making, and the HBC people were making a claim on the land that belonged to Nisqually people and other people who had been there since time immemorial.
Of course.
Yeah.
So then, jumping a few decades into the future, once Seattle, as the kind of far western outpost, started to grow, cows were no longer wandering through the woods, but were wandering the streets instead.
Right.
So, which it seems quaint and kind of hard to believe that you'd find livestock just wandering freely in what is we consider now a major city. So how was Seattle unique in that way? Was it unique?
Seattle was not unique. I mean, I think cows in cities were a fairly common phenomenon into the early 20th century. There are even census records that would try to define what are all the cows and horses that are not on farms but live in cities. And so as Seattle was growing and kind of on the edge of town, but close to downtown, when it was a small place, people would keep cows and they would want to graze them in public places. So there was this complex system of moving them from place to place, and often young boys or girls would watch them as they went from place to place and try to keep track of them generally. But then there were struggles over what the city meant and what it meant to have a modern middle class city, and gradually rules are put in place about where cows could roam.
So let's talk about those rules and kind of where they generated from and who was behind that. At what point, what was the tipping point for saying, you know what, cows need to be less of a presence here, and we need to take ourselves seriously?
The big tipping point was 1907 when it became illegal to graze cows almost anywhere in the city. But in the years from 1851 to 1907, there were these gradual struggles of defining a cow limits line, which was like inside of that limit, your cows couldn't roam free, and you could only have them there if they were in your backyard or you were escorting them. But outside those limits, they could roam free and find grass. So there were city officials who worked at the cattle pound, which was like the dog pound, but was for impounding cattle, and it was in what's now downtown Seattle, near where the Westin Hotel is. So there was this cattle pound that would, if your cows violated that rule, there was a pound master who could impound that and make you pay a fine. So there were city officials imposing rules about where cows should roam, and it was property owners and the wealthy especially who wanted to have city streets without cows, and it was generally more working class people who had cows and had a supplement to their income.
So, they supplemented income in that, were they raising these cows to be butchered? Was it primarily for milk and butter and cheese?
In the city, it was primarily milk cows. So cattle to be butchered came from farther away, but it was common for a family to have a cow or to have 2 or 3 cows, and either to provide milk for the family or to trade with neighbors or get a little bit of extra income. So it kind of fit into a working class economy of the man might have a job outside the house and the woman at home would take care of the cows, or there'd be some other system where it kind of fit into piecing together an income.
Sure. And in 1907, I'm trying to remember my science history here. When was it that pasteurization finally became kind of widespread and a common practice?
In the early 20th century, it became a common practice, and there were debates before that about whether pasteurization was the best way to keep milk pure or careful certification of the conditions under which cows lived. And so that kind of played into these issues of in some places, cows in cities were fed very low quality feed and they'd become sickly, and then their milk could be poor quality.
I see.
It was called swill milk because swill is what's left after you're done with using grain for making beer. So
I see. Okay.
yeah, so it's a while people thought the best thing is to certify that they're living in good conditions, but by I don't know the exact date, 1910 or 20 or so, pasteurization became generalized and required in the norm. Yeah,
I see.
And and you can sort of track deaths going down as milk is produced under better systems and as pasteurization is put in place.
Absolutely, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So cows, it seems like their utility was still there, but there was no longer the need to have them quite so close as they had been for those 50 or so years.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, horses had their own utility, but it was a different kind of utility.
Right.
And they stuck around longer.
Yeah.
So what were the kind of jobs that they were doing?
Yes. Yes, it's interesting to compare cows and horses because cows more generally were working class people owned them, but horses were more wealthy people we think of cars replacing horses, but really very few people owned horses. And once cars came along, you get a situation where 80 or 90% of people own them. So when horses were the main form of transportation, it was mostly companies, businesses, and wealthy people that owned them. So they were moving goods around the city, and they provide various sorts of other work like providing pulling carriages from department stores to people's homes, or lifting heavy objects into place through systems of levers and so there's a variety of work that they were doing, and they were kind of the main source of power other than human beings. And
right.
And then steam engines replaced them in railroads, and then by 1900 or so, in electricity and gasoline cars start to replace them.
Yeah, as I remember from your book, it's a rather precipitous increase in the number of cars from about the early 1910s to just like within a decade, we went from a few hundred cars to tens of thousands, right?
Right. So, I would say from like 1900 to 1930, you kind of went from having hardly any cars to them being very common in the city and for the most part replacing horses. A few people still kept horses in the 30s, and a few people had a sentimental attachment to them. But economically, for most people, if you kind of looked at what's the most inexpensive way to move goods around the city, was generally with a truck.
So there were, citywide regulations put into place to kind of cancel out cows.
Yeah.
Were horses similarly limited by law, or was it just kind of there's nowhere to put them, so they just got phased out that way because they weren't as practical?
There were laws regulating keeping horses in various ways, but generally it was just the economic utility of them went down. So it was they were never banned in the way that cows were, and gradually companies decided that automobiles were better, and just a few people kept them that had a sentimental attachment, and city departments would debate through the 10s and 20s and early 30s. They'd debate which is more efficient, and there's some advantages with horses, like the milk routes. The horse can learn the route, and the horse can walk and stop at each house because the horse knows the houses, and then the milk carrier can work with them. So there are some advantages, but overall, the big problem is you have to keep horses alive when they're not working, whereas a truck you can turn it off and it's not consuming fuel. So,
Sure.
Yeah.
And as I recall, there were some outcry around how some of these horses were being treated
Yes.
in
Yeah.
public, and that kind of led to this humane movement.
Right.
So talk about that. Like, where did that come from, and what
Yeah.
did it look like here in Seattle?
Yeah. So horses working in the street were kind of one of the most visible forms of animal suffering that people saw. So it became the focus of the humane movement, and it was a national movement that local people in Seattle became involved with in the 1890s, and it really got a big impetus with the gold rush and all of the animals that were coming through Seattle to be taken to Alaska.
To be shipped up. Okay.
To be shipped, either horses and dogs and mules. And I mean, horses were always part of this capitalist economy, and there was a risk of treating them badly. But in the gold rush, there was this huge impetus to make lots of money, so there's a lot more suffering that people could see. So that was a big impetus to create a humane society in Seattle, and to start trying to improve conditions for horses, and so there were humane officers whose job it was to make sure that horses were treated well and to see how they were being treated, and on occasion to put down the horses that they thought were suffering. So,
right.
So it's kind of brutal, humane way of treating animals.
Yeah, and to kind of tie this back to how animals were being used to shift things socially for humans, the humane causes also became identified as a feminine issue, right? So it was mostly the women advocating, but then we still had men kind of in figurehead positions.
Right. Humane societies often the women did most of the work, and they're often the secretary of the society was a woman who did most of the work, but often the men would be in the figurehead position. So, so there is this gender aspect to the humane movement, and there's also this class aspect. It was focused on how working class people were mistreating animals, these workers with horses, but didn't focus on elite activities that hunting or things like that would have impinged on what elite people could do. So there are different ways in which it tied in with ideas of class and gender
it always
in the city.
Does, right?
Yeah.
So these humane societies are still with us today and doing good work with things like no-kill shelters and just animal welfare in general. So to draw on another animal community here, dogs, like cows, not like horses, but like cows, had kind of free reign to do as they would during the day, and then that started getting curtailed. Were the humane societies part of that, or was this being driven by some other factors? Yeah, well,
humane societies were involved in running dog pounds and reducing the number of dogs on the street. But the growth of middle class neighborhoods and I think the increasing number of dogs made it more and more of an issue to have all these dogs on the street, because originally there was a dog license, was literally a license to let your dog roam free, but at that point there were very few dogs, and they were almost owned by communities, and they would go between different houses. But as the number increased, there were the sorts of problems you can imagine of waste on people's lawns and
digging up
gardens and bushes, and also kind of developing middle class neighborhoods with these nice amenities that dogs could threaten. So there was more and more debate about the best way to deal with that, and the idea of leading a dog on a leash wasn't very common in the early 20th century. But
when did that become the norm?
Yeah, so there was a vote in 1957, I think, to whether there should be a leash law, and a leash law was passed, and after that there was this requirement that you have your dog on a leash, and then the next step was the pooper scooper law, I think in 1973, which is that you had to clean up after your dog, which now seems surprising that people wouldn't, but that was sort of a new concept and seemed a little bit strange to walk around and pick up after your dog. But and partly as there were more and more, the number of dogs really increased a great deal as incomes rose and people had more money to have dogs, and perhaps also as there were fewer livestock and people have a natural desire to interact with other animals. So the numbers really started increasing, and in order to make it work, you needed these new ways of dealing with it.
That reminds me, there's one piece of livestock that we've not touched on yet, and chickens,
Right.
which were commonplace for much of Seattle's,
Right.
Well into the 20th century. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. So they were commonplace in the early 20th century. There are definitely many families like the smaller number who had cows. There were a large number of families that had chickens as a supplement to their income and a supplement for nutrition, to get eggs and to slaughter them eventually. And that was a working class strategy of getting by in the city, and middle class neighborhoods eventually started pushing this aside.
So they seem much less invasive than cows wandering freely. So
Right.
why did the city feel that chickens needed to be tamped down?
I mean, it's partly a cultural idea that the animals you want in your neighborhood are these pets that you have this benevolent relationship with, and not these working class relationships. And then there are some problems that chickens cause by roosters crowing and creating noise, and chicken feed attracting rats and other things like that. So, and it's hard to piece out exactly how much the cultural and how much the health issues play into it, but they kind of both work together. And middle class neighborhoods started banning these in the early 20th century, and then by the late 50s there was a citywide ban against them.
And yet now, talking here in 2025, there are backyard chicken coops all over Seattle.
Yeah, so there was
what happened?
So there's this working class strategy to survive with chickens, and gradually was pushed aside and outlawed in the late 50s. But by the early 70s, there was the Back to the Land movement, and people.
So that didn't last very long.
No, it was about less than 20 years. But so it's hard to verify this, but I have this feeling that like the children of farmers are glad to be done with country life and things like chickens, but the grandchildren have a certain nostalgia for it, and this Back to the Land movement developed, and they started advocating for this. And this was not so much a working class strategy as a middle class strategy to be more sustainable, to have this connection with animals, to have this connection with where your food comes from, and so it was reauthorized in the early 70s and Seattle Tilth was active in doing that. Yeah.
So I guess chickens today then are kind of a hybrid of livestock and domestic pet status.
Yeah.
Right?
Right. So they're not pure livestock, and a lot of people that keep them couldn't imagine slaughtering them once they've reached old age and are no longer producing eggs. So some people do, but it's more of a pet. It's more of a pet livestock hybrid.
I see.
Yeah.
So even as over the years the city took actions to push livestock outside of the city limits, these animals were still being trucked or by train brought in to the city's slaughterhouses.
Right.
Which there are currently none in the city limits. Is that?
That's right. Yeah.
But for a long time in the mid 20th century.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about what that scene was like and where those were.
Yeah. So there were a number of slaughterhouses. The last one I closed, I think, in the 1980s in the International District, Acme Poultry. But there were lots of slaughterhouses for larger animals and for chickens in the International District and south of there in what's now Sodo in the Industrial District. So animals were, the mid 19th century, they were walked from the Yakima Valley to Seattle, and then
walked. Wow.
Yeah, before railroads, and then
wow. Okay.
And then with railroads, they were coming from a broader area, from Montana and Idaho, and
I think you said the Dakotas at some point, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So really far away, and Seattle was a center of this kind of activity, and it was kind of a sign of a modern city that you had the ability to have meat on a regular basis, and that in the 19th century, meat wasn't as easy to get as it is now, and it's
Sure.
sort of a sign of progress. And the people running the slaughterhouses would talk about their modern city and their modern facilities,
Mm-hmm.
and we're proud of there were 4 or 5 different slaughterhouses in the industrial district, and
Wow.
so city people into the 1950s, into the 1970s and 80s, people lived in the city and worked in these slaughterhouses, and it was much more present in people's lives than it is now.
Mm-hmm. So there was still, I mean, it's not quite, seeing the livestock wandering through your backyard and then it ends up on your plate, but there's still a somewhat tenuous connection between
right.
The animals that citizens were consuming, whereas now,
Yeah.
I mean, there's labeling on food, but
right. Yeah. Now
it's
yeah, there's a great deal of distance, and people don't know exactly where their food comes from. But into the mid 20th century, people could see this part of town, and they could maybe smell it if they lived on Beacon Hill, and
the wind is blowing the right way.
Yeah, they might know people who work there, so it was much less of a distant thing, and they had a much better sense of.
So was it that kind of environmental unpleasantness that ultimately drove the slaughterhouses outside of the city?
That was part of it. That people could smell it far away, and there were rules throughout the history of Seattle about where slaughterhouses could be for those reasons, and people definitely kept them out of middle-class neighborhoods, and people didn't want them in other neighborhoods. But so I think those sort of unpleasantness and health issues were part of it, but I think also efforts at getting a cheaper workforce that wasn't unionized also was a strategy of the meatpacking companies to move it to other places and
right.
find and there are, immigrants have often worked in slaughterhouses, but there's an effort to find new immigrant populations from Latin America that weren't unionized and that could be paid less. So
I see.
So the economics of it,
profit margins,
was part of it.
Yeah,
as well.
So speaking of knowing where our food comes from, I think one food item that we are continually aware of is salmon.
Yeah.
And I mean, that it goes all the way back to HBC in the mid 19th century.
Yeah, right.
And kind of talk about how salmon has been at the center of culture here long before white settlers.
Yeah.
So how, kind of juxtapose for me, natives' view on what the salmon meant culturally, and then how that was undercut by white settlers coming in and everything else that we did to disrupt habitat and the environment along the way.
Yeah, I think, salmon are interesting because I think a lot of these other animals, Seattle is a case study of what happened in other places with cows and horses and dogs and cats. But with salmon, it's somewhat unique that we're a city where people have been fishing for salmon here for thousands of years, and people are still fishing in salmon, including indigenous people who have treaty rights to fish them. So there's that continuity.
Treaty rights that are kind of scattershot applied.
There's all sorts of debates about it, but there's still some native fisheries in Puget Sound. As I said about other animals, that I think native people had more of a reciprocal relationship with salmon, and an idea that these were salmon people, and humans have a need to be respectful for them and treat them and have a first salmon ceremony, whereas for white people they were a pure commodity for the most part, and a way to make money and a way to feed people, and in early Seattle, I think, kind of a cultural touchstone that white people didn't like, because it was a novel food that didn't seem European to them.
The subsistence coexistence with animals versus the game of hunting them and spending your leisure time to to slaughter.
Yeah. So, so new white settlers really wanted to get those domestic animals they were familiar with and move away from a diet of salmon. I mean, now salmon are beloved by almost all people in the Northwest as a food and as a cultural icon, but the smell of salmon and having to eat them wasn't as that beloved by white settlers, but it was an integral part of Native people's lives as it still is.
Yeah. So the Native peoples coexisted with salmon for millennia.
Yeah.
And white settlers came in, really disrupted a lot of things, and the salmon populations have struggled, to put it mildly, since then. But we're recently starting to take steps to rehabilitate them into the environment. What lessons do you think we can draw about food sustainability and environmental sustainability from, how we've treated salmon or, any other livestock, and like kind of how we've changed the land to suit us and our capitalistic needs?
Yeah. So I think, I hope my book kind of makes the point that we need to be aware of the broad connections.
Definitely.
Connects it to animals in distant places, that it's easy to just focus on the animals we see and think about, like cats and dogs, and not think about these other places. But salmon are so affected by what's happening far away, by development and farming. So a sustainable way of dealing with them involves, the whole state working together and connecting to distant places and trying to restore their populations. And
that makes sense. So I guess kind of looking at the roughly 170-year history of Seattle, what patterns of humans controlling animals do you see still either in practice or kind of echoing in Seattle here in 2025?
Yeah, well, the big thing I think about is that how we tend to think of dogs and cats as the most important urban animals, but really it's chickens that are, because there's so many chickens in faraway places that are living somewhere and then being slaughtered or making eggs to feed people in the city. So you see these patterns of more and more where our food comes from is hidden, and I think a more sustainable way of living is if we're sort of more aware of that and try to think if we're, not only do we like the way we relate to our cats and dogs, but do we like the way we relate to those distant animals that are feeding us.
Yeah, that makes sense. Fred, thank you for the conversation today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
What's next up for you? What are you working on?
What I'm working on now is another book called Birds of Home, a multi-species history of European starlings, house sparrows, and other immigrants in North America. And it's about these acclimatization movements in the 19th century to bring European songbirds from Europe to North America. Europeans wanted to hear the familiar songs of home, and they thought they could improve nature and get rid of unwanted insects by bringing these birds. So I'm looking at the motivations of these acclimatizers and how it didn't work out that well, and how there's this complex, interesting story in these birds we see every day, starlings and house sparrows.
Interesting.
So,
and when can we expect to be recording that?
Hopefully it'll be out within a year or so.
Wonderful.
Yeah, I'm working on the final draft, and we'll see what peer reviewers say about it, but hopefully it'll be out next year.
I look forward to it.
Thanks.
Fred, thanks again for the time.
Thanks, Chris.
Take care.
The City is More Than Human, An Animal History of Seattle, is available in the catalog of the Washington Talking Book and Braille Library. You can find it as an audiobook with the class ID DBC 15698, or as a Braille book with the class ID BRW 08743. If you have any questions or comments about the library, or to see if you qualify for our services, visit WTBBL.org or leave us a voicemail at 206-615-0400. or toll free at 800-542-0866. This episode of Literary Notes is a production of the Washington Talking Book and Braille Library, based in Seattle, Washington. I'm your producer, Nathan Ureta. Thanks for listening.